50 years ago, the American dream felt attainable. The wealthiest 1% of Americans took home a sizable, but not unthinkable, 11% of the nation's income. Meanwhile, the poorest half of the country shared 20%, a balance that gave millions a shot at prosperity. But today, the dream is slipping away. The top 1% now command a staggering 20% of all income, while the bottom half, just 12%, less than ever before. And then there's the ultra-elite, the wealthiest 0.1%, a group small enough to fit inside 3 NFL football stadiums. Yet they control nearly 20% of the nation's wealth, an average of $90 million each. So how did this happen? Why has American politics failed to do anything about it? Why do 243 million people support tax policies that mostly benefit just 240,000 super wealthy individuals? It turns out there's a powerful reason. It's something that Oxford University professor Ben Ansell calls the equality trap. It's the idea that the very freedoms we cherish, like the right to work where we want, how hard we want, and the right to choose how we spend our money, are what makes fixing inequality so difficult. In this video, we'll break down exactly how America got stuck in this trap, why it's so difficult to escape, and some clever ideas to dig ourselves out. Here's the thing about billionaires. They aren't to blame for the system. They play by the same rules as the rest of us. They have the same economic freedoms, the right to earn, spend, and invest however they choose. Sounds fair, right? But here's where it gets tricky. Those freedoms make it really hard to tax their wealth in any meaningful way. Firstly, if the government tries to raise taxes on the rich, they can simply shift their money around. Instead of sitting on their wealth, they can spend it on things like private jets, luxury mansions, or super yachts, so they have less wealth to tax. Or they can choose to move to another country, somewhere tax rates aren't so high, and the weather is perfect for relaxing on a yacht. But the real power of billionaire wealth isn't in what they buy, it's in what they influence. Since the Supreme Court's Citizens United ruling in 2010, money has had a loud voice in American politics. The court ruled that spending money on political campaigns is a form of free speech protected under the First Amendment. This opened the floodgates for billionaires and corporations to pour their wealth into shaping elections, policies, and public opinion. Now, why would billionaires care so much about democracy? Because it's their safe haven. In places like Russia or China, being wealthy can be downright dangerous. The government might seize your assets, toss you in prison if you step out of line, or worse. But in a democracy, freedoms and institutions protect wealth. Billionaires know this, and they use it to their advantage. So here we are, caught in a tough spot. We love our freedoms, but those very rights create a system where wealth piles up at the top and inequality grows. How do we reconcile this? That's the billion-dollar question. Imagine a society where everyone is perfectly equal. Same pay, same resources, same everything. It sounds great at first. But then, a tough question pops up. Who's going to do the work? Will everyone just willingly put in the same effort out of the goodness of their hearts? Or would we need to force people to work, stripping away their freedom to choose how, when, or even if they contribute? Now, let's say we give people total freedom to choose their jobs, how hard they work, and what they do with their money. What happens? Some people work harder. Some have unique talents. And others might take it easy. Naturally, some will end up earning a lot more than others, and over time, the gap widens. Suddenly, we are staring at a world where billionaires soar to the top, while others struggle at the bottom. Neither extreme feels right. On one side, we risk losing our freedoms just to keep everything equal. On the other, we risk creating a society where wealth and power concentrate in the hands of a few. The challenge is finding a balance, a sweet spot where we preserve individual freedom but still prevent inequality from spiraling out of control. It's easy to assume equality has always been one of society's core values, but for most of history, that wasn't the case. Many of history's greatest thinkers have had very different ideas about fairness and power. Take Plato, for example. He envisioned a society led by philosopher kings, a small group of wise, educated leaders who he believed were uniquely suited to rule. Aristotle, Plato's student, went further. He argued that inequality was natural. claiming women and slaves were inherently inferior and should occupy lower roles in society. Fast forward a few hundred years, and there's Thomas Hobbes, who believed in the necessity of a powerful, centralized authority. He believed natural equality would lead to chaos unless controlled by a leviathan to maintain order. Later, Friedrich Nietzsche outright rejected equality, seeing it as something that held humanity back. He championed the idea of the Übermensch, or Superman, an exceptional individual who rises above societal norms to lead and innovate. For Nietzsche, equality was a barrier to greatness. For centuries, inequality wasn't just accepted, it was actively defended by some of history's most influential thinkers. These ideas shaped societies where rigid hierarchies were the norm. But as modern values shifted towards equality, a new challenge emerged: understanding inequality and measuring the staggering levels that persist today. To understand inequality across countries, economists use a tool called the Gini index. It's a simple scale from 0 to 1. A score of 0 means perfect equality. Everyone has the same income or wealth. A score of 1 means perfect inequality. One person has everything, and everyone else has nothing. This single number gives us a snapshot of how evenly money is spread within a society. Let's compare some countries. The United States has a high-income Gini score, just over 0.6, reflecting significant inequality. Canada, meanwhile, sits slightly lower at 0.5. In Europe, countries like the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Sweden fare much better, with scores around 0.45, signaling more balanced income distribution. Norway stands out with one of the lowest Gini scores among developed nations, at 0.33. But the Gini index isn't just about income. There's also a wealth Gini index, and this paints a far starker picture. Wealth inequality is almost always greater than income inequality. In the US, for example, the income Gini is high, but its wealth Gini is a staggering 0.85. That's a level of inequality that's hard to comprehend. The top 5% of earners in the US take home about 33% of all income, but the wealthiest 5% control more than 70% of the nation's total wealth. The US is the 25th most inequitable country out of 171. Sweden is the only Western nation with higher wealth inequality. For comparison, Canada ranks 132nd, and the United Kingdom ranks 141st. So how do countries address this imbalance? Taxation plays a big role. Progressive taxes, where wealthier individuals pay a higher percentage, can help redistribute income and reduce inequality. In some countries like Finland, France, and Belgium, robust tax policies significantly lower their Gini scores, creating more equitable societies. But not all governments are as effective. The United States and Switzerland, for example, have less aggressive taxation systems, which means their Gini scores stay high, even after taxes and social benefits are factored in. In the United States, the federal income tax as we know it was introduced in 1913 through the 16th Amendment. Back then, it was designed to target only the wealthiest Americans, with rates starting as low as 1% and capping at just 7% for the ultra-rich. Sounds quaint by today's standards, doesn't it? But then history happened. 2 world wars and the Great Depression led to massive economic shifts. Governments needed funding, and taxing the wealthy became a crucial way to pay for national defense and recovery. In the US, income tax rates hit their highest point during World War II, when the top marginal rate soared to an eye-watering 94%. Yes, 94%. The idea was simple. The richest Americans needed to contribute the most to the war effort. These astronomical rates weren't permanent, but they reflected a global consensus. Those who had the most should contribute the most to rebuilding society. Now here's the interesting part. Before World War I, the richest 1% in many countries held around 20% of total income. But the chaos of 2 world wars and aggressive taxation during the mid-20th century changed that. By 1970, the share of income held by the top 1% had plummeted to just 10%. It seemed like inequality was being tamed. But then, starting in the 1980s, something shifted. Under leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, tax rates on the wealthy began to drop dramatically across the world. Policies favoring deregulation and free markets allowed the rich to accumulate wealth more quickly. By the year 2000, the top 1% in the US were back to holding 20% of total income. In countries like Canada, the UK, and Germany, it was closer to 15%, still far higher than the low point in the 1970s. The strange thing is, the public response to rising inequality hasn't been a call for a return to a golden age of high income taxes. If anything, it has been an outcry for more tax cuts. In the face of growing gaps between rich and poor, why didn't democracies push for more fairness through the tax system? Shouldn't voters in a democracy naturally push for policies that create more equal outcomes? At first glance, it seems straightforward. If taxes fund benefits like schools, roads, and healthcare, you'd expect that low and middle-income earners who get the same public services as the wealthy, but pay less, would support higher taxes. Meanwhile, high-income earners who pay more but don't get any extra perks are more likely to resist. So, as inequality grows, you'd think the median voter in a democracy would demand higher taxes on the rich to close that gap. You'd expect democracy to act as a check and balance against too much inequality, but that hasn't happened. The answer is that people just don't like taxes. Economist G.A. Cohen offered a thought-provoking idea. For true equality to work in a democracy, we'd need something he called an egalitarian ethos. This isn't just about laws or policies, it's a mindset. People would need to genuinely believe in the value of equality and willingly embrace it, even if it meant giving up the chance to earn more than others. We wouldn't need harsh tax policies because social norms would guide behavior. But let's be real, that's a pretty big ask. Most people are wired to pursue their own interests, and being okay with earning less so everyone else can have more isn't exactly human nature. Without that ethos, democracies struggle to balance fairness with freedom. So why don't most Americans see higher taxes as beneficial? Firstly, many people believe that governments spend money inefficiently. Back in the 1970s, economist Arthur Okun came up with a brilliant way to explain this. He called it the leaky bucket analogy. Imagine you are trying to take money from the wealthy and give it to the poor using a bucket. But there's a catch. The bucket has a hole in it. By the time you deliver the money, some of it has leaked out. What causes the leak? A few things. When taxes get too high, wealthy people might work less or stop investing. Governments, with their red tape and bureaucracy, might waste resources through inefficiency or corruption. And then there are loopholes, people hiding their money or moving it to places where taxes are lower. The result is that you lose some of the wealth you're trying to redistribute. Secondly, as discussed earlier, it is possible that high levels of economic inequality are actually necessary to stimulate productivity and innovation. Inequality doesn't just happen. It can grow in one of two ways. First, imagine the economy as a fixed pie. If one group takes a bigger slice, someone else has to settle for less, and it often feels unfair. The second way happens when the pie itself grows. New wealth is created, but some groups claim a bigger share of those extra slices. In this case, inequality doesn't come from taking, it comes from how the new growth is distributed. During periods of economic growth, inequality often rises because innovators and investors take a larger share of the new wealth. While this can seem unfair, it can also drive progress, creating opportunities for everyone. The question then is, how much inequality are we willing to accept to keep the system running? And at what point do we say enough is enough? Here's an unexpected twist. Rising inequality can sometimes be a side effect of greater social equality. Let's look at a couple key changes in how society and work have evolved. First, consider the dramatic shift in the workforce over the past century. More women now work outside the home, a huge win for equality and opportunity. But this change has also affected how inequality is measured. Since women are more likely than men to take part-time jobs, and part-time jobs often aren't fully reflected in annual income statistics, it makes inequality seem worse. And when you include the fact that women are paid less than men for the same work, the gap grows even wider. Then, there's something called assortative mating. It's a fancy term for a simple idea. People tend to marry partners who have similar education levels, earning potential, and backgrounds. This has a big impact on household incomes. Let's break it down. Imagine it's the 1950s. Most households had a single earner. the husband. A working class man might make, say, $50,000 a year, while a manager might earn $100,000. The income gap between the middle class and upper class is $50,000. Fast forward to today. That same working class man now has a working class wife, and together they earn $100,000. Meanwhile, the manager is married to someone just like him, another high earner, and their household brings in $200,000. Suddenly, the gap between the middle class and upper class has doubled to $100,000, even though everyone's individual pay might not have changed much. Now throw in the fact that lower income families have higher divorce rates, and it's quite possible that that working class household might split into two separate households, each with just $50,000 in income, widening the divide even further. So while progress towards gender equality and changing family dynamics are undoubtedly good things, they've also created new complexities in how we measure and experience inequality. So how do we keep economic freedoms, ensure social equality, and stop economic inequality from spiraling out of control? It's a tricky balancing act, but one thing is clear: it will take bold political decisions. We need to rethink how we educate workers, regulate industry, and tax the wealthy, all while keeping productivity and innovation intact. One famous idea comes from economist Thomas Piketty, who proposed a global wealth tax. The idea is to tax the wealthiest people around the world on their net worth, not just their income. While the precedent for global cooperation exists, for example, the 136-country agreement on a minimum 15% corporate tax, getting every government on board for a wealth tax feels like a long shot. A wealth tax is a levy on an individual's total net worth. The most common examples of wealth taxes today are property taxes, estate taxes, and inheritance taxes. Property taxes are wealth taxes because they are based on how much your property is worth, and the more valuable your property is, the more tax you pay. Estate taxes are taken from the total value of someone's assets after they pass away, while inheritance taxes are paid by the people who receive those assets. Given the unpopularity of income taxes, the idea of wealth taxes might seem like a no-brainer for public support, given how few people would actually be affected. Yet history tells a different story. In a 2015 United Kingdom poll, most people thought taxes on alcohol and cigarettes were fair. Slightly more than half were okay with income taxes. But when it came to inheritance taxes, taxes that were actually paid by less than 4% of estates, only 20% of the population thought they were fair. Many people see it as double taxation, arguing that wealth has already been taxed when it was first earned as income. Let's take a look at the Bush tax cuts of 2001. These cuts largely benefited the richest Americans. By 2010, the top 1% of Americans had received 52% of all the savings. Despite this, fewer than 20% of Americans disapproved of Bush's tax cuts. Why?
Just a one-finger victory salute.
Many people actually focused on whether they were being taxed too much, rather than on whether the rich were being taxed too little. So what are the alternatives? One idea is to tax gains from speculative assets like stocks, cryptocurrencies, or second homes, where rising prices often have little to do with the owner's effort. This could avoid the perception of double taxation while targeting unearned wealth. Another option is to raise capital gains taxes, which are typically much lower than income taxes in most countries. But there's a trade-off. Higher capital gains taxes could discourage investment, potentially slowing economic growth. One of the more innovative ideas is the robot tax. The concept, backed by people like Bill Gates, suggests taxing companies when they replace human workers with machines. The idea is simple. If automation reduces jobs, companies should contribute more to the social safety net. A robot tax could fund programs like retraining workers for new jobs or even a universal basic income to support those displaced by automation. On the flip side, this tax could discourage innovation, slowing progress in industries like healthcare or agriculture, where automation can make a hugely positive impact. It might also hurt competitiveness, pushing businesses to relocate to countries without such taxes. Plus, defining what counts as a robot is difficult. Is an algorithm a robot? Besides, a robot tax isn't ultimately paid by a robot. It's paid by the human being who owns the robot, which brings us right back to square one. So, since taxation is so unpopular, what if we could tackle inequality before it even happens, instead of relying on taxes to fix it afterwards? That's the idea behind pre-distribution. Instead of redistributing wealth through taxes, this approach focuses on reshaping the economy itself, regulating wages, empowering workers, and making smart investments in people. Let's start with wages. One way to reduce inequality is by raising pay for the average workers directly. Regulations like minimum wage laws can ensure fairer compensation across industries. Another possibility is strengthening trade unions. When unions are strong, they can negotiate better pay and conditions for workers. But as union membership has plummeted in many Western democracies, the bargaining power of workers has eroded, leaving many unable to keep up with the rising cost of living. Then there's the idea of investing in people. Governments could focus on improving education, especially for those from poorer backgrounds. The goal is to give everyone a fair shot at higher-paying jobs and to boost productivity across the board. Economists call this social investment, policies designed to help people get ahead, rather than social consumption, which focuses on transferring money to those in need. No single approach is likely to solve the world's inequality problems. Governments will need to focus on taxing the wealthiest people in a way that people find fair. They will need to strengthen labor unions or enact regulations that push wages up for the average worker. And they will need to invest in targeted programs to ensure the benefits of education create opportunities for everyone, not just the lucky few. In the end, tackling inequality isn't about choosing between freedom and fairness. It's about finding the balance that lets both thrive. The challenge is immense, but so is the opportunity. By rethinking how we shape our economy, we can build a future where success isn't limited to a few, but shared by all. The question is, are we ready to take that step? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Politics Reimagined to join us on this journey of exploration and innovation. Together, let's turn the failures of today into the solutions of tomorrow.